Hey guys, Aaron Cybertron Zhang here. Today, I wanted to take a look at the top returning Pokemon in Scarlet and Violet for the VGC metagame. I picked just under 20 Pokemon that I think will be especially popular in the early VGC meta. This video goes over each Pokemon briefly and talks about why they may potentially be strong, and each Pokemon is also timestamped accordingly below. Please note that this list is just my opinion. There are certainly other excellent returning Pokemon that will see usage, but I just wanted to help you all get a sense of what returning Pokemon you should expect to see or maybe consider using as VGC kicks off. I've been having a lot of fun making these guides before getting into battling, and if this is something you enjoy, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like and let me know what else you'd like to see on the channel in the upcoming days. I'd really appreciate it. Anyway, let's get started. The first Pokemon to talk about is Arcanine. I think Arcanine is the king of regional dex formats, and if you look at the 2017 and 2020 format, you'll see exactly just how dominant Arcanine was in the early meta. That's often because it is one of the best fire-type options that you have available to you. In addition, it's just one of the best Intimidate users that you can have, and it gets access to a really deep offensive and supportive move pool. Generally, we've seen it being used with recovery berries in the past, but we've also seen it occasionally being used offensively with items such as Life Orb, Assault Vest, and Choice Band. I would expect a lot of Arcanines at the start of the VGC format in Gen 9 to kind of be a more supportive set. Maybe you run Flare Blitz, but you'll run Will-O-Wisp, Protect, and a fourth option, but this is a Pokemon that is incredibly flexible. The next Pokemon to talk about here is Amoonguss. Amoonguss has been really good in practically every VGC format that it's been allowed in since its introduction, and I think that it'll continue to be a top tier support Pokemon thanks to access for Rage Powder and Spore. Of course, naturally, it pairs exceptionally well with Pokemon that want to boost their own stats or set up Trick Room. One of the most common strategies we'd see is Amoonguss plus a Trick Room user. You get Trick Room up, and if Amoonguss is able to survive, then great, it can Spore things, and if it doesn't survive, great, you get a free switch it into whatever Trick Room sweeper you want. One cool thing about Amoonguss is that both Effect Spore and Regenerator are great abilities, and both have actually been used to great success in the past. I think generally Regenerator is the safer ability to go for so that you can get guaranteed recovery if you switch out, but both are certainly viable. One thing that I think is interesting in particular is the idea of Iron Ball Amoonguss. Now, I think that Torkoal might be fairly common in the beginning of the format, and so if you're expecting to go up against a lot of Trick Room teams, you can let your opponent set up Trick Room, bring out Iron Ball Amoonguss, and put them to sleep. So, just something I thought about in my head. I have no idea whether or not it'll actually end up being played. I don't know if Torkoal will actually be as popular as I expect it to be, but yeah. Going in line with Pokemon that can put others to sleep, Breloom is the next Pokemon to talk about. This one's interesting because Breloom was a decent pick back in 2013 and 2015. In fact, I won a regional championship with it in 2013 where you would combine it with Liepard. That was an especially strong duo that a lot of high-level players used, but since then it really has just completely fallen off. It's almost always run with Focus Sash, but you should also expect to see the random Choice Scarf here and there for surprise spores. Breloom, in my opinion, in VGC is fairly one-dimensional. You should expect max attack and max speed generally with the Focus Sash like I mentioned, but just having access to a decently fast Spore alone makes it a strong threat. One cool thing is that it does get close combat as well, so you can actually deal a fair amount of damage. Back in 2013, the moveset was Spore, Bullet Seed, Mach Punch, and Protect, so you have a little bit more offense available to you. Moving on, we've got Corviknight. Corviknight, I think, was one of the coolest Pokemon in Sword and Shield, but it never really got to take off in Gen 8 VGC, and I think that's because Dynamax made it fairly difficult for it to thrive, especially given that Charizard ended up being one of the most common Pokemon in Sword and Shield VGC. Now that Dynamax no longer exists, I think that Corviknight can be a really solid defensive option. Like, it also set up Tailwind. One thing that's interesting is that in this format, there aren't really that many priority Tailwind users. The only two are actually Talonflame and Murkrow before we get any DLCs or Pokemon Home, for example. And so, yeah, I think that we might see a shift to go back to just regular Pokemon that utilize Tailwind rather than prankster Pokemon or Pokemon with priority. And Corviknight can be one of those options. A lot of the top physical attackers also generally struggle to KO Corviknight easily, and so this can wall Pokemon like Garchomp, for example. Corviknight is also set up against opposing teams through the Iron Defense and Body Press combination, and that's something that we saw have a fair amount of success throughout Sword and Shield on a variety of Steel types like Ferrothorn and Registeel. The next Pokemon to talk about is Dragapult. Now, Dragapult I think is really interesting. It was one of the fastest Pokemon in the game in Sword and Shield, and it is also one of the fastest Pokemon in the game in Scarlet and Violet. In fact, the only Pokemon in the regional Pokedex that outspeeds it is Electrode. Now, even without Dynamax, I think that Dragapult can still be a strong threat as it can be incredibly flexible and run in a variety of ways. However, it is important to call out that Dragapult mainly was dominant throughout Sword and Shield because of Dynamax. It would allow you to use moves like Fly with really no drawback because it would turn into a Max Airstream. For Dragapult in this format, I would expect a wide range of viable items, whether it be Life Orb, Choice Band or Specs, Focus Sash, or Light Clay. As you can see, it gets a ton of really solid options from physical to special to support, and so yeah, I think fighting against this Pokemon might be a little bit tricky because you don't know which of the variants it's going to try to be. The next Pokemon to talk about is one that is a very familiar face to old VGC formats. That's Garchomp. Now, Garchomp has been a really strong staple through many years of VGC because of its great typing, really solid speed, and just one of the strongest Earthquake users you could have. Garchomp's been quite flexible in the past as well. A lot of players opted for pure offense, but you'd also see players opt to give it a ton of bulk and run a type resist berry. What's interesting about terrestrializing is that it allows Garchomp to cover for multiple weaknesses, and like I mentioned, Garchomp used to run Yache or Habomberry quite frequently, so now you don't need to run those berries as much with Terra, and in fact, you can go for another item. I think offensive Terra is actually a really strong option with Garchomp as well, rather than defensive, and it can be especially strong when you're combining it with something like a Life Orb or a Choice Band with Ground Terra, for example. So Garchomp also just gets access to a wide range of moves that you can see below, and of course does have the ability to set up with Swords Dance as well. After Garchomp, we've got Grimmsnarl. Now, if you watched or played Sword and Shield VGC at all, you'll know just how good Grimmsnarl was literally from day one of the format all the way until the very end at the World Championships. The reality is that this is just an exceptional support Pokemon thanks to its diverse move pool and Prankster. And Grimmsnarl actually got buffed in Generation 9, and now it gets access to Parting Shot as well. I'm not sure why they decided to give it, but it's certainly a decision. Anyway, you should expect players to adapt the popular Grimmsnarl sets from Gen 8, whether it be Light Clay, Trick and Iron Ball, or Lagging Tail, or Focus Sash. I do think one interesting thing about Grimmsnarl is that throughout Sword and Shield, Fake Out was probably not as common as you'd normally expect it to be, and that's of course because Dynamax was a thing. But now that Dynamax no longer exists, I'd expect maybe Fake Out to pick up in usage a little bit more. I also think the idea of offensive Grimmsnarl is just interesting because when people see this Pokemon, they always expect it to be support, and I wonder if anyone's going to explore it with Terra. Coming up next, we've got Gyarados. Now, Gyarados naturally is a good Pokemon to point to because it gets access to Intimidate, and so it is just one of the best Intimidate users in this Pokedex. One thing to note is that this Pokemon did get nerfed slightly since Sword and Shield. It lost access to Power Whip, so it can't dunk on Gastrodons as easily, and the lack of Dynamax means poor flying type options in terms of attacks. Terra is nice for Gyarados because it allows for it to cover for its electric type weakness, and Terra Ground in particular is nice, right? It is completely immune to electric type attacks, and it also synergizes nicely if you're running Earthquake on Gyarados. Historically, Gyarados has been run in a variety of different ways, whether it be an offensive sweeper with an item such as Choice Band or Dragon Dance with Lumberry, or mixed support. Waterfall with more supportive options such as Taunt and Thunder Wave has also been a thing. Overall, I think this Pokemon is fairly flexible and you'd want to splash it on if you want an Intimidator, and there's so many different ways you can utilize it. The next Pokemon to talk about is Hatterene. Now, Hatterene was one of the most common Trick Room users at the start of Sword and Shield, and it also got a really solid Gigantamax form that would induce a lot of variants. Both Hatterene and Indeedee, which was an infamous combination, are back, so naturally that's a Trick Room duo that you may want to consider team building around. However, one big note here is that both Pokemon actually lost access to Expanding Force, and so it's not nearly as powerful as it was in Sword and Shield. One thing that was annoying for many players to do when going up against Hatterene and Indeedee is that, yeah, like often you wouldn't even be able to knock out either, and then the Hatterene sets up Trick Room and then double Expanding Force spam in Psychic Terrain, which is so powerful. In the end, though, even with that, I think Hatterene is still a great Trick Room user since you get access to Magic Bounce, which prevents Taunt, and like I mentioned, I think Torkoal will be fairly common in the early VGC meta, and I would expect this to be paired with Torkoal early on. The next Pokemon to talk about here is Hydreigon. Now, Hydreigon is actually one of the strongest Pokemon back in VGC 2014. You would often see it with max special attack and max speed, and throw Choice Specs onto it. It has an incredibly deep move pool for a sweeper, and just has absolutely incredible type coverage across the board. Now, Terra is really nice for Hydreigon because it allows you to cover for multiple weaknesses while also retaining your offensive capabilities. So Terra into something like Steel, for example, is really nice because now you're not 4 times weak to Fairy type attacks, and you're not weak to Dragon type attacks. A couple popular items that players have used on Hydreigon in the past before include Choice Specs, which I mentioned earlier, Life Orb, Choice Scarf, and Habomberry. And as you can see, it just gets access to a wide range of options, and even gets access to moves like Tailwind and Snarl. Following Hydreigon, we've got Indeedee. Indeedee was an excellent redirection user back in Sword and Shield because of its great bulk and its ability to just set up Psychic Terrain. Setting up Psychic Terrain is really nice because it prevents your opponent from just easily flinching you with Fake Out on turn 1 of the battle, and that in itself is a pretty big deal. As I mentioned earlier, Indeedee did receive a pretty major nerf. It no longer gets access to Expanding Force, but to add insult to injury, they also took away Mystical Fire, and those were really the two main attacks you would generally run on Indeedee. Now, I think losing these moves is fairly unfortunate, but at the end of the day, I think that you use Indeedee mainly for support, not for offense, so it's really not the end of the world. I think I generally expect to see it being run the same way as it was in Sword and Shield, so that's maybe with the Focus Sash or Psychic Seed, and this Pokemon is just really predictable, but at the end of the day, it's still hard to prevent the strategies that Indeedee is being used to support. Following Indeedee, we've got Mimikyu. Now, Mimikyu has been a staple Trick Room user for many years now and many generations, especially thanks to its ability Disguise. There are no major changes from Sword and Shield, and so naturally I think it's going to be an easy starting point for people that might want to build hardcore Trick Room teams or just have a Trick Room component to their team. Like in Sword and Shield, I think that a lot of Mimikyus are probably going to want to run Mental Orb to cover for all the taunt options that may be out there, or Safety Goggles to give yourself a slightly better matchup into Amoonguss. That means they can't put you to sleep, and then Mimikyu can actually taunt them if you're running that on your moveset as well. So yeah, this isn't really any different from the Mimikyu that we saw previously, but a good starting point for those that might want to explore Trick Room. Following Mimikyu, we have one of my all-time favorite Pokemon, Rotom-Wash. Hello, Darkness, my old friend. Jokes aside though, Rotom has always really been a staple in a lot of these regional dex formats thanks to its great type coverage, and it gets a wide range of supportive attacks as well. One cool thing about this is that you can make it pure electric via Terra, getting rid of the grass type weakness, and thanks to Levitate, suddenly you're just not weak to anything. Rotoms in the past, generally, the set that was really common in 2013 would be Will-O-Wisp, Hydro Pump, Thunderbolt, and maybe Protect, or a filler move. I think that in this generation, Nasty Plot might become a little bit more common, and it's interesting, right, because you theoretically could run Terra Blast Rotom as well, so it could be Nasty Plot, Hydro Pump, Thunderbolt, and then a Terra with a unique Terra typing. So yeah, generally I would expect Rotom to be run the same way with the kind of bulky support with Will-O-Wisp, but I can also see it being run fairly offensively with Nasty Plot. But Dynamax is no longer a thing, and so that's one thing you have to keep in mind. After Rotom, another one of my favorites here, we've got Scizor. Scizor was incredible back in VGC 2012. Both Wolf and I actually won the US National Championships in Masters and Seniors respectively with a Sword Stance Scizor set. The idea was that you would set up a Sword Stance, and with Steel Gem, you'd be able to pick up a one-hit knockout onto things like Garchomp, for example. Unfortunately, Scizor really fell off afterwards, and that's for a couple of reasons. The first is, Gems just no longer became a thing, and then they created Incineroar, which was just an awful matchup for Scizor to begin with. And to add insult to injury, in this generation, they actually got rid of both Dual Wing Beat and Bug Bite for Scizor, but the one upside is that now it gets access to close combat. I can potentially see Scizor being a strong pick to counter Sylveon, which I think will be potentially popular in the early metagame. And one thing about Scizor is that you really shouldn't underestimate its damage output, whether it be from Choice Band or Sword Stance Bullet Punch. Scizor also gets access to a couple of new moves, such as Pounce and Trailblaze, so it opens up for a couple of more options on it. Speaking of Sylveon, we've got Sylveon as the next Pokemon. I think Sylveon's pretty interesting in the early metagame because we've talked about a fair amount of dragon types, Hydreigon, Garchomp, Dragapult. I think Dragonite's also another one that's not included in this video, but is one that I would expect players to maybe use early on. And so Sylveon naturally is interesting because it does threaten a lot of those dragon type threats. One thing that's interesting is I actually think a lot of those dragons may run a Terra specifically so that they aren't just obliterated by something like Sylveon, but on paper at least then it forces them to Terra. Sylveon did get hit with a slight nerf in Generation 9, so now it no longer gets access to Mystical Fire, making it harder for it to hit Steel types, and Scizor on the previous slide is now very happy. In previous formats, players would generally use items such as Pixie Plate, Throat Spray, Choice Specs, Citrus Berry, and Leftovers. Pixie Plate was really consistent, but it's not in the game currently, so you can't use that. I think that most players who are going to use Sylveon early on are either going to use a bulky Calm Mind Leftover set, or really just a more traditional Sylveon, and I would expect the more traditional Sylveon to be more common. I spent a fair amount of time talking about Torkoal, now it's time to actually dive into it. Now, Torkoal is great in this game in particular because of course it can naturally set up the sun, which is really important for a couple of Pokemon. Torkoal is also one of the most potent sweepers thanks to sun boosted eruptions, and as you can imagine, it benefits greatly from just Terra into Fire. It pairs really nicely with Trick Room users because of course it's super slow with base 20 speed, and it's also quite good with Chlorophyll Pokemon such as Lilligant. Logan Torkoal was actually just a really, really annoying duo to fight against back in 2017, and yeah, it's returned here. I think Torkoal's inclusion in the format in itself is interesting because it's going to make other people think a little bit more about bringing their own weather control, whether it be a weather user themselves, such as Tyranitar, or natural weather, such as having Rain Dance on a Pokemon. Speaking of weather, after Torkoal, we've got Tyranitar. Now, Tyranitar historically has just been one of the greatest all-time Pokemon in VGC history, and it's really impacted so many different generations of play. It did lose a couple of moves in Generation 9, High Horsepower, Superpower, Roar, and Toxic. Out of those, I'd say the one that really hurts the VGC Tyranitar is Superpower. Terra is really nice for Tyranitar in particular because it allows it to turn into types like Ghost, Flying, or Fairy to really avoid the major weakness to fighting that you're normally afraid of. And as I mentioned, I think that because Torkoal might be common or other weather might be common, Tyranitar will be important for weather control against those options. Tyranitar gets a really deep set of offensive options as well, but, you know, you should generally expect to see moves like Rock Slide, Crunch, Protect, maybe Dragon Dance or something over the Dragon Dance. And it actually does get access to a nice range of supportive attacks as well, as you can see below. The final Pokemon that I have to talk about here is Volcarona. Now, Volcarona is a really interesting Pokemon because throughout VGC history, we've actually seen the way that it is used changed completely from format to format. For example, back in 2013, it was a potential Quiver Dance sweeper where you would get a Quiver Dance off, outspeed things, and then get a Fire Gem boosted Overheat off against things. And then when Z Crystals came back, then that was also kind of a similar concept. We've also seen being used as a Kangaskhan counter, especially in 2015, where with Rocky Helmet and Flame Body and Rage Powder, you could make Kangaskhan very, very sad just in a single Rage Powder. I think in Gen 9, a lot of early meta players will probably use it in a similar manner, whether it be Quiver Dance sets to sweep or more supportive sets such as Rage Powder and Will-O-Wisp. It is definitely one of the top redirection users, but I think one thing you have to keep in mind is that you can run into trouble against the Terra Grass Pokemon. I really don't know how common that's going to be, but Terra Grass I think may make sense for a couple of reasons, whether it be defensively or to, you know, potentially not get hit by Spore from Amoonguss, for example. So that's just one thing you got to watch out for. But overall, this Pokemon gets access to some really nice offensive options and also gets access to nice defensive options such as Will-O-Wisp and Tailwind. So yeah, that's basically it. I wanted to do basically brief 1-minute summaries on a lot of the top returning Pokemon you should expect to see. As I mentioned, I can't cover for everything here, but hopefully this gives you a better sense of what Pokemon you should expect to fight against that are from the previous generations when VGC kicks off here in Scarlet and Violet. Thank you so much for watching. As always, my name is Aaron Cybertron Zhang. Leave a like if you enjoy, and I'll catch you all next time. Alright, peace.